Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Burn Your Draft, the podcast exploring the Reed College senior thesis process. I'm Ace Lackey, your podcast producer. In today's episode, host Avis Correa interviews Ocean Chamberlain about their thesis on Caribbean philosophy. On this journey, we'll hear about creation myths, French colonization, and the importance of storytelling.
My name's Ocean Chamberlain. I was raised in Belize, and then I came to Florida for high school, and then I went to Portland for college. I was a comparative literature major. My thesis advisor was Catherine Witt in the French department, and my thesis is called Rhizophora. My thesis is about the writings and the philosophies of Édouard Glissant, who was a French poet and philosopher from Martinique, which at the time was a colony of France, and then later on became a department of France, meaning that it is supposed to have the same amount of rights as it's like a state of France basically. And so the first chapter is analyzing his first book, Son of Consciousness, which he published in 1956, an ethnography of the self. And the second chapter is looking at the writings of several other French Caribbean or English-speaking Caribbean writers and how they influence or are influenced by the writings of Édouard Glissant. Rhizophora is the Latin word for mangrove. So Édouard Glissant was really influenced by the writings of Deleuze and Guattari. He was personal friends with Félix Guattari, who came up with this idea of rhizomatic thinking in their book, A Thousand Plateaus. So he's basically trying to make all of his writings rhizomatic instead of like straightforward and clear cut, like from origin to effect. And so that basically means that the writing is very dialectic, I suppose. Like he's trying to like everything, he sees everything as being affected by and affecting everything else in the world, and he wants his writing to reflect that. So a mangrove is a rhizome, so I'm kind of bringing that metaphor back into the Caribbean by naming it after a mangrove.
We're working with the premise of everything affects everything, basically.
Yes, and also the way that we're taught things in schools, particularly related to history and literature and philosophy, kind of promotes this idea of like Westernism and like Western centricism. Because, for example, the way that we're taught history, it's like this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And the main characters in the story are typically the United States or Great Britain or France or wherever else. And Édouard Glissant has this line in Poetics of Relation where he says something like, I'm paraphrasing, but he says that anything that is outside of the West is either assimilated or annihilated. And kind of in this like timeline of history that we've been fed growing up, every mention of a non-Western place is like a side note or a footnote or a side character that is later colonized by or destroyed by the West. So he's interested in kind of looking at history as something that is like fiction sort of, and kind of trying to create a not a new narrative, because that would just be kind of like superimposing another problem over to the first problem, but disrupting the narrative in such a way that Martinique and other places outside of the West are included and don't feel like such ahistorical places.
And how exactly does he do that?
I had one understanding of how he did that, and then I had to rewrite my first chapter because I realized that my understanding of it was wrong. So in Son of Consciousness, which is the book that I focused on in my first chapter, he talks a lot about like these creation myths that he comes up with. So a little bit of context for where he's coming from. Martinique has this volcano on it called Montpellier, and back in the age-old time when Montpellier exploded, it formed all of the Lesser Antilles. So the Caribbean is divided into several different areas. The Lesser Antilles is the area with all the smaller islands, so Barbados, Martinique, St. Lucia, kind of at like the tail end. And so those are all volcanic islands that were formed by Montpellier. And because he's from Martinique, he was kind of using a lot of metaphors to like lava and to this volcano as kind of like, like the birth of humanity, kind of like its own creation myth. But then later on, I realized that, like I said earlier, like he wasn't really interested in creating a creation myth, because that would just be like, moving the narrative to a different place instead of getting rid of the narrative altogether. I think what he does instead is he's very invested in the future, and he's interested in kind of like where we're going from here and like what we can do with that. And he's invested in like taking away the idea of history as a necessary fact at all, if that makes sense.
And just to clarify, the work of this author is purely fiction, or is he trying to like retell the stories of the past in his publications?
He does a lot of genre bending. The book that I wrote on, if you look it up on the internet, it'll call it travel writing. And in a way, it is travel writing because he wrote it after he finished his dissertation in Paris. So he's like in Paris, kind of talking about his experience being in Paris. It's very anthropological. He calls it an autoethnography. He says at one point, I'm writing from the gaze of the sun and the vision of the stranger because he feels like a son of France, but he feels also like an outsider of France. There's poetry intertwined, like mixed into everything. He also wrote some fiction books. I think his fiction books are the only books by him I haven't read at this point. And then later on, he wrote some more kind of like strict philosophy, like philosophy that doesn't bend genres. But he's a gorgeous writer. I mean, even in his most like academic book, which I would say is probably Caribbean Discourse, which is like his sociology thesis, it's just like absolutely gorgeous storytelling and anecdotes interwoven through, and there's interviews and just like these beautiful, beautiful lines that like really, really stick with you. Like he's a fantastic writer.
Yeah, what kind of inspired you to choose this author and his work for your thesis?
Well, I had a difficult time choosing my thesis topic. I don't think I had a solidified topic until like the last week of October or first week of November, which is pretty late on in the process. I originally wanted to write about this Sufi poet, Ibn Arabi, but I don't speak Arabic, so the thesis would have been kind of shallow. And I don't think that I knew that it was a good idea for me to write about him until after I started writing about him. I discovered his writing in Natalia King's Intro to Literary Theory class when I was a junior. We had to read the open boat chapter of Poetics of Relation. And the last paragraph in that chapter really, really, really struck me for how poetic the prose was, and also just for like his ideas and what he was saying. Yeah, so I decided to go with that. I decided to write about Son of Consciousness before I had read it, found a copy somewhere. I think I had to like it was only translated into English in like 2022, I believe. So I had to order the copy from like the publisher itself. And yeah, it ended up working out really, really well. Sometimes, I don't know, it feels kind of like it was destiny. Sometimes things just work out really nicely.
Oh, that's awesome. So at the time, his writing wasn't even translated into English in a very widespread manner. Like he was still very obscure, or would you say he's still very obscure?
He's definitely more obscure than I thought now that I've left Reed. I think in Reed he's pretty well known and like often taught, I think. I was kind of surprised by how little people knew him when I went to France later on. He was a student of Aimé Césaire, who is a little bit more famous. So people know him usually, and he was also friends with Frantz Fanon. He was like a similar time. I think he was in the same class in high school as Frantz Fanon in Martinique, actually. So people often know about him, but people don't often know about Édouard Glissant. And it's interesting because someone else I wrote about in my second chapter is Derek Walcott. And Derek Walcott won the Nobel Prize for Omeros, and Édouard Glissant was second place for that same award. And I always wonder, had Glissant won, if he would have the fame that Walcott has.
You're from a Caribbean country, Belize or Belize. This connection is very personal, clearly, between you and the author. I can definitely understand this idea that you mentioned earlier of countries like Belize and this other Caribbean countries kind of being secondary characters in history. And I'm sure that the work of this author seems like something that is necessary, like very important for countries like Belize to be viewed not as a secondary character in history, but a character. Could you talk about that a little bit, maybe?
Like, this is like a really big debate that I have with myself, honestly. And me and my aunts and uncles and stuff talk about this every once in a while. And it's like, is the question to become a character in the already woven tapestry of history, or is the question, is it a matter of something else that could be more important, like cultural preservation, or I don't know, I want to say happiness, but that's such a loaded concept. I mean, take for example, well, I don't want to call out like any specific country, but you do have countries that are these major players, and their people are very unhappy, and they're destroying their environments with oil drilling and all of these other things, and their artifacts are still in museums in the United States, and they lack language preservation and cultural preservation. And so is it really the goal to be a character in this thing of history? Which is kind of what Glissant gets at a certain point too. It's like it's not necessarily our role in history, but the concept of history and the way that we teach history overall that needs to be criticized. I talk about Derek Walcott a lot in my second chapter. So Derek Walcott is originally from St. Lucia, but he lived for most of his life in Trinidad and Tobago. And there's this other really famous author from Trinidad and Tobago named V.S. Naipaul. And V.S. Naipaul is someone who does not take a lot of pride in being from the Caribbean. He says nothing good could ever come out of the Caribbean. And he has a lot of embarrassment about being a country in the Caribbean that was colonized by the British. He says that he wishes that he was colonized by the Spanish instead of that the colonizers stayed, because then there would be monuments, there would be cathedrals and like cobblestone streets and all of these things that we don't have in the Anglophone Caribbean. And he says that like there is no history in the Caribbean, that nothing can ever come of it. And then Derek Walcott responds and says that that's not true because like the sea is our history and there's so much history. Like it's like why do we want monuments? Why do we want edifices? Why do we want like cobblestone streets when still so much is lacking?
Could you take us back to the first moment when you decided to be a comp lit major and when you opted to study at Reed?
Oh, I knew I was going to study comp lit in high school, actually. I had one friend who was a year older than me, and she ended up going to Barnard to study comparative literature. But even when she was a senior in high school, so I was a junior, she was like, I'm going to study this. And I would look into it, like, that's awesome. I'm going to study that too. And yeah, I think I was one of very few people who came into Reed as as an incoming freshman studying comparative literature. How I decided to study at Reed, I still really don't know how I found out about Reed because I was in like South Florida. Yeah, I probably met like maybe like three other people my entire time at Reed from Florida. They must have sent me something in the mail at some point, but I just kind of ended up applying. But yeah, it worked out. They gave me money to fly up and see the campus, and I was like, this is cool. Never been to Portland.
Oh, okay. So would you say that Reed found you?
Yeah, they courted me for sure. They like seduced me.
Oh, wow. Now that it's all over, do you think it was the best choice you could make?
I mean, I think that I'm very lucky that I'm a very optimistic person, and probably anywhere that I would have went, I would have said that this is the best choice for me. And because I went to Reed, I can say that that was the best choice for me, you know?
You mentioned already that you knew you wanted to be a comp lit major. Along the way, did you ever nurture any other interest that wasn't related to comp lit somehow?
Before I wanted to study comparative literature, I wanted to be a musician and a composer. So the music department was kind of always in mind for me. And there was also a brief moment where I thought I might study art history, but there was never a moment in my life where I thought I might study something practical that could make me a lot of money.
Oh, I see. Okay, so would you say that what you studied didn't is not something practical?
I mean, I think it's extremely practical. I think that I've developed a whole bunch of skills from comparative literature that a lot of my peers lack.
So it's been a year, but I hope you still remember what the process looked like for you. What did a day of work look like for you?
I would go to the Multicultural Resource Center because my laptop was on the verge of breaking. And I would go into like the private study room there and I would stay there until like sometimes 5 or 6 in the morning and just write as much as possible and not read anything of it and then like wait a few days and then read that like after it had like cleared out of my head. And I had like a whole bunch of books in the and like that room too. It was basically my office space. Yeah, me and those Edo and green teas. That was kind of it.
Wait, so you didn't have a thesis desk?
Well, you don't have desktop computers at your thesis desks, and my laptop wasn't working, so I would use a desktop computer there.
Other people have kind of explained to me, I don't know, would write like 25 pages in a single day and stuff like that. How many pages would you write per day?
Definitely not that many. That's really impressive, honestly. I would probably write, I think I wrote 25 pages at a time once for my introduction, but that was kind of easy because it's all background information. That's one benefit about writing about something that is like so obvious to me as being someone who comes from the Caribbean, but is so niche to other people, is that like my entire introduction was all stuff that I had learned by the age of like 8 or something like in school, but it was like all new and necessary information to who I assumed my audience for the thesis would be. But when it came to like literary analysis, I'd probably write like up to 10 or 12 pages in a sitting.
Now that you're done with it, looking back, what advice would you give to yourself?
I think that there is, at Reed especially in the thesis process, a lot of pressure to come up with original thoughts. And that's very stressful in the beginning of the thesis process because original thought ideally arrives earliest in like March, I feel like, of the thesis process, maybe. Like it's like, okay, I want to write about French Caribbean philosophy and poetry. Original thought is synthesis of information, and you can't do that without having the information. And sometimes the process of gaining that information can feel really taxing and lethargic and like it's going nowhere. And then you get all of these doubts about like, what am I saying? Why am I saying it? Is it important? Why is it important? Like all of these things. And I think it's really important to remember that one, original thought must come after all of that. And two, what you're doing for the first 3 quarters of the thesis is the very intentional act of observation on something that you're interested in. And the act of observation itself is the basis of knowledge and beauty and hope and all of these fantastic things that are necessary. And it's okay to let go of control in that way, I suppose. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, it's all right to not figure everything out until a week before the deadline. It's okay to just read and read and read and then write a little bit and then read some more. And then eventually, like, you'll figure out why you're doing it, you know?
Towards the end, you figured out why you were doing this year-long project.
I think definitely. I think I figured out too, like, my year after read, I was like, this stuff is really valuable to me now. This stuff actually kind of shaped me as a person. That's really cool.
And did you run into any unexpected challenges during your thesis process?
I actually had to go on emergency leave twice during the thesis process. Someone in my family passed away, so I had to go home in first semester to take care of them and my family while they were in the hospital, and then second semester when they passed away to go to the wake and see the body and everything. And then spring break, I had to go home for the funeral. And yeah, that's why my thesis is 2 chapters. Honestly, like it was kind of a really, really, really crazy year. I had really fantastic roommates. They took care of me. And I had a really fantastic thesis advisor. Katrine took care of me. Yeah, I was in good hands. So I was able to finish regardless. I think also too, and in an odd way, having like experiencing everything that I was experiencing while reading like Caribbean philosophy was so important because like I mean, like the pages of my book, like Son of Consciousness, they're like crispy because of water damage from like these waterfalls in Belize that I was reading it at, you know? And so much of Glissant's writing is about environments and how that affects everything, but especially language and philosophy and like literature. And so having the experience of reading Glissant with and sometimes even for my family while being in the Caribbean was really, really valuable and life-changing.
What was the actual outcome of your project?
Honestly, I'm really proud of it. There's some things I would change, I think, but not many. I definitely rewrote it a few times. Yeah, I'm happy with it. I mean, I don't think that it's to the like I don't think that it's like to the level of like a PhD dissertation or anything, but I think it's perfect for exactly what it was. And I think I'm really proud of myself for accomplishing it with all the obstacles that I faced. This one error in the abstract that I wish I could fix because I thought I was going to talk about a poet that I ended up not talking about, and it says I'm going to talk about that poet in the abstract. If I could change anything about my thesis, if I could change anything about my life in general, I would change that one thing. It bothers me like I think about it like once every few weeks. It's awful. But other than that, I'm really happy with it.
Was your thesis what you expected when you started it?
No, not a single bit. Like not at all. It turned so many different ways at so many different points. I think that when I started my thesis, I don't know if I really had an idea for how it was going to turn out. I had a lot of trust in the process, and I knew I was in good hands with Katrine. And I think that I was going to talk a lot more about like the concepts of time, like this like philosophy of time than I ended up being able to do. Glissant is really interested in this idea of like rhythm and measure, and also like I mentioned earlier, like chaos. And so I was hoping I could do a more strict analysis of that, but things ended up weaving into Derek Walcott and Amos Zizai's territory towards the second chapter.
Could you kind of give us your understanding of why it's important and who you think this should or has impacted?
I guess like kind of in a way I want to say like why is anything important, you know? Like why is literature important? Like why is poetry important? Why is philosophy important? I think the answer is because I think that the role of a poet or an artist or a writer or a musician or anyone who kind of dedicates their lives to these very fickle things is in order to create and manifest a vision for the future for a people to rely on, or at least to look forward to, the GPS in a way. And it's so lacking today. Like writers these days are so invested in like in memory and melancholy and like and dissociation. And no one's really inventing the future anymore. And I think Glissant was trying to invent the future a little bit. And so was Derek Walcott, and so was Amos Zizai. And so I'm hoping that this thesis can at least highlight them, if nothing else.
How do you think your thesis experience will or has informed your life after Reed, and what are your plans after Reed, and how does it relate to your thesis?
When I graduated from Reed, I was briefly working as an archivist at the Belize School of Music, interviewing musicians around Belize, kind of piecing together like a history of music in Belize. So that was definitely the most related thing I did to my degree. And then after that, I was briefly a personal chef for a family in the French countryside. And then I started working as a yoga teacher for little kids in Paris. And then I ended up working as a professional tarot card reader in a nightclub. And then after that, I was working as a studio assistant for this artist. Then I was a barista. And now I'm going to work the salmon season commercial fishing in Alaska. There's this concept in my thesis that Glissant writes about like errantry. It's like this idea of kind of like a purposeless journey, or like a journey where the purpose is to have no direction. So I've been doing that. I've been trying to learn as much as I can from different people and different teachers around the world, and trying not to stress out my mom too much. Overall, it's been good.
What advice do you have to listeners who are starting Reed or their thesis?
Okay, starting Reed, I would say take advantage of every single possible way that you can get money from this school, because Reed is so fantastic in that like they'll give you money to pursue any single hobby or passion that you have. And I feel like so many people don't take that because they feel like they don't deserve it. And it doesn't matter if you deserve it or not. If you want it, then go for it. And that's the advice that I give to my little sister who's going to college right now. And that's the advice that I give to like pretty much everyone younger than me. You know, if there's like something that you want, then ask for it. I would say just don't be in your head about anything, and push yourself outside of your comfort zones. And things in this world usually provide to you as much as you put into them.
Is there anyone that you want to thank or acknowledge that helped you during your thesis process?
Definitely Katrine, like a million times. Natalia King, all of my roommates. I love them so much. And my sisters, for sure, for listening to all of my ramblings. And the staff at Paradox. Yeah, my brother-in-law for being awesome. Definitely all of my professors for giving me so much leeway in helping me graduate this semester and really working with me when I was going through such a hard time in senior year. Sarah Shack for passing me in biology, because no one in my family thought I was going to pass biology. All of the biology majors who also helped me pass biology. Yeah, I'm definitely missing people, but that's what I got for now.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Every single piece of this author that you've shared has been quite beautiful. All I can say is thank you for taking the time and for letting me interview and for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us, Ocean, and good luck with your life beyond Reed. May your errantry take you far and wide. If you enjoyed Ocean's story, I hope you'll join us again to hear more students and alumni talk about what it means to burn your draft. And be sure to subscribe, check out our X, Facebook, and Instagram pages, and write a review on Apple Podcasts. Burn Your Draft is a production of Reed College and the Center for Life Beyond Reed. Created jointly by students, alumni, and staff, this episode was produced and engineered by me, Reed College student Ace Lackey. Our executive producer is Seth Paskin, class of 1990, with technical advising from Joe Janiga. Our project manager is Nate Martin, staff member and class of 2016. Music by Jack Salvucci, class of 2020, and podcast art by alumni Henry Gotchlich and Lillian Pham. This podcast was made possible by a gift from Seth Paskin.